I never thought my retirement would involve forensic accounting and public takedowns, but life has a funny way of pulling you out of the comfortable chair you've spent 40 years earning. My name is John, and for most of my life, I was a general contractor. I built things, fixed things, and solved problems with my hands and a healthy dose of common sense. When I finally hung up my tool belt for good, my plan was simple: enjoy my workshop, tend to my garden, and live out my days in the quiet, predictable peace of Oak Creek Meadows, the subdivision I'd called home for nearly 3 decades. For a long time, that plan worked perfectly. Oak Creek Meadows was the kind of place people moved to for the quiet. The houses were well built, mostly by the same company back in the 80s, and sat on decent-sized lots with mature oak trees that gave the neighborhood its name. We weren't fancy, but we were comfortable. For years, the Homeowners Association was little more than a social club that made sure the small community clubhouse got a new coat of paint every decade and organized the annual 4th of July barbecue. It was a $5 a month affair, a formality run by volunteers who cared more about neighborly harmony than enforcing rules. We took care of our own lawns, looked out for each other's houses when someone went on vacation, and generally operated on a principle of mutual respect. It was, in a word, pleasant. Then Carol moved in. She arrived about 5 years ago, buying the corner house on Maple Lane after a messy and, from what we heard, very public divorce. She was a woman who seemed to vibrate with a nervous, unspent energy, the kind of person who couldn't stand to see a world that wasn't organized to her precise specifications. She had sharp, inspecting eyes and a way of speaking that made every statement sound like a final verdict. Within 6 months, she had volunteered for the HOA board. Within a year, through a combination of relentless campaigning and the general apathy of everyone else, she was elected president. The changes started small, almost too trivial to protest. First came the newsletter, a glossy, 4-page document filled with passive-aggressive reminders about bylaws nobody had ever heard of. Then came the official warnings. Little laminated cards tucked under windshield wipers for cars parked on the street for more than 24 hours. Notes taped to front doors about the unacceptable height of lawn grass, measured to the 1/4 inch. Suddenly, the placement of your trash cans on pickup day became a matter of intense regulatory scrutiny. They had to be precisely 3 feet from the curb, handles facing the house, and brought in no later than 6 post-meridium. People grumbled, of course. We'd all lived here for years without needing a manual on garbage Connecticut. But it was easier to comply than to fight. It was just a trash can, after all. How much trouble could she really cause? That was our collective mistake. We underestimated her ambition. Each small victory, each instance of our weary compliance, emboldened her. The $5 monthly fee ballooned to $50, then $100. The money, she explained in her increasingly condescending newsletters, was for beautification projects and enforcing community standards. The old, splintery sign at the neighborhood entrance was replaced with a monstrous brick and wrought iron edifice that looked like the gate to a forgotten dukedom. She hired a landscaping company, one nobody had ever heard of, to mow the small patch of grass around the clubhouse for a price that could have maintained a golf course. The board, once a casual group of neighbors, was now her personal council of yes-men, a collection of timid souls who were either impressed by her authority or terrified of becoming her next target. We were no longer neighbors, we were subjects. My own quiet life remained largely untouched for a while. I kept my property neat, followed the more reasonable rules, and ignored the petty ones I could get away with. I was retired. My goal was to minimize conflict, not seek it out. I'd spent a lifetime dealing with difficult clients, stubborn inspectors, and unreliable subcontractors. I was done with fighting. I just wanted to build birdhouses in my workshop and watch the world go by from my front porch. I figured if I kept my head down, Carol's reign of suburban terror would be a distant storm I could safely ignore. I was wrong. The storm was heading directly for my front door, and it was about to make landfall in the form of a certified letter. The inciting incident, the thing that finally dragged me from my peaceful retirement and into a full-blown war, wasn't a note about my lawn. It was an invoice. Or rather, a special assessment notice that arrived on a cold Tuesday in November. I opened the crisp envelope from the Oak Creek Meadows Homeowners Association and unfolded the letter. My eye scanned the page, and the number at the bottom seemed to leap out and slap me across the face. $80,000. The board, the letter stated in Carol's signature officious tone, had approved an emergency and essential full roof replacement for the community clubhouse. The total cost was $80,000, and this special assessment was being levied to cover it, effective immediately. My share, due in 30 days, was just over $1,000. I stared at the number, a cold knot forming in my stomach. $80,000. For the clubhouse roof. I knew that clubhouse. I had helped the original builder frame it on a Saturday 30 years ago. It was a simple structure, about 1,200 square feet with a straightforward gable roof. There were no complex dormers, no steep pitches, no fancy materials. It was a textbook asphalt shingle job. I had spent 40 years in the construction business. I had bid on, supervised, and built hundreds of roofs, from simple garages to complex commercial buildings. In my head, I did a quick, generous calculation. Materials, labor, permits, a healthy profit for the contractor, maybe $12,000. On a bad day, with premium materials we didn't need, $15,000. But $80,000? That wasn't a price. It was a heist. My first instinct was that it had to be a typo. A misplaced zero. Surely, they meant 8,000. But the professionally printed letter and the cold finality of the language told me otherwise. This was real. Carol and her board were trying to push this through. My peaceful retirement suddenly felt like a distant memory. I couldn't just pay this. It wasn't about the money, though $1,000 was certainly not trivial. It was about the principle. It was wrong, plain, and simple. This was my trade, my area of expertise. I couldn't stand by and watch my neighbors, many of them elderly and on fixed incomes, get fleeced. The next HOA meeting was a week later, held in the very clubhouse with the supposed $80,000 roof. The air in the room was thick with tension. Usually, these meetings were attended by Carol, her board, and maybe 2 or 3 other lost souls. Tonight, there were at least 30 people crammed into the small space, all of them clutching their assessment notices. Carol sat at the head table, flanked by her board members, looking entirely unbothered by the simmering anger in the room. She had an expression of serene self-satisfaction, as if she were a queen bestowing a great gift upon her restive peasants. She ran through the agenda with brisk efficiency, ignoring the anxious shuffling and quiet muttering from the audience. Finally, she came to new business and announced the clubhouse roof project as a triumphant success. As you all know, she began, her voice dripping with condescension, the board took decisive action to protect our most valuable shared asset. Thanks to our prudent management, the new roof will secure the clubhouse for decades to come. She didn't invite questions, but an elderly man in the front row, Mr. Henderson, a retired accountant, timidly raised his hand. Carol, he started, his voice a little shaky, $80,000 seems, well, it seems quite high for a roof of this size. Could the board provide a breakdown of the costs? Perhaps the bids you received? Carol's smile tightened into a thin, hard line. The board conducted its due diligence, Mr. Henderson. We selected the most qualified contractor for this critical project. The decision has been made and recorded in the minutes. We are not here to second-guess a decision that has already been finalized. Her tone was a clear warning, sit down and shut up. But I couldn't. This was my moment. I had to speak. I stood up from my chair in the back. My name is John Miller, I said, my voice coming out steadier than I expected. I live on Oak Drive. I was a licensed general contractor in this state for 40 years. I know what a roof costs. Every eye in the room turned to me. I could feel Carol's gaze burning into me. $80,000 is not a reasonable price for this roof. It's not even in the realm of possibility. I would formally like to request, as is my right as a homeowner, to see the competing bids you received and the final, itemized invoice from the contractor who performed the work. The silence that followed was deafening. Carol stared at me, her face a mask of cold fury. This was a direct challenge to her authority, in public, from someone with credible expertise. She wasn't used to that. She was used to grumbling and compliance. "Mr. Miller," she said, her voice dangerously low and controlled. "You are out of order. The board's decisions are not subject to a public audit by every disgruntled resident with an opinion." "This isn't an opinion," I replied calmly. "This is a professional assessment. I am not disgruntled. I am concerned. Concerned that this association is being mismanaged and that its members are being defrauded." That was the word that did it. Defrauded. A gasp went through the room. Carol's face turned a shade of mottled red. She stood up, pointing a trembling finger at me. "That is a slanderous accusation. According to Bylaw Section 7, Paragraph 3, any member who engages in disruptive behavior or makes unsubstantiated accusations against the board can be subject to fines. I am warning you, sit down. It's only an unsubstantiated accusation if you refuse to provide the documents that would substantiate the cost." I shot back, holding my ground. "Show us the invoices. Show us the bids. If the $80,000 is legitimate, you should have no problem being transparent." "This meeting is adjourned," she shrieked, banging a small gavel on the table with such force that it bounced onto the floor. "And you, Mr. Miller, will be hearing from the board. You can expect a formal citation and a fine for your behavior here tonight." She gathered her papers, refusing to make eye contact with anyone, and stormed out of the room, her board members trailing behind her like frightened ducklings. The room erupted in a buzz of conversation. Several people came up to me, patting me on the back and thanking me for speaking up. But as I walked home that night, I knew this was only the beginning. I had publicly declared war on Carol. And I had no doubt she would use every ounce of her petty power to make my life a living hell. The first salvo arrived 2 days later. It was a crisp, white envelope with the HOA logo, delivered to my mailbox. Inside was an official notice of violation. The fine was $250 for creating a hostile and disruptive environment at the board meeting. The notice cited the bylaw she had quoted, and it stated that failure to pay within 15 days would result in a late fee and further punitive action. It was absurd, of course. Weaponizing the bylaws to punish dissent. But it was also a clear message: this is what happens when you challenge me. I set the notice on my kitchen counter and sighed. I knew this was coming. What I hadn't anticipated was the sheer pettiness of what came next. The following week, another notice appeared, this time taped to my garage door. A $50 fine for a prohibited fluid leak on my driveway. I went out and examined the spot. It was a single, quarter-sized drop of oil, the kind of thing that happens to any car older than a week. I looked up and down the street. At least 5 other driveways had similar, or worse, stains. But I was the only one with a violation notice. A few days after that, it was my garden hose. I had left it coiled neatly by the spigot, as I always did. Another $50 fine. The violation? Improper storage of landscaping equipment. According to a rule I'd never heard of, all hoses had to be stored on a reel or completely out of sight. I was being targeted, systematically and relentlessly. Carol was building a case against me, papering my file with violations to paint me as a problem resident, a troublemaker who didn't respect the community's rules. It was a classic bully tactic: isolate, harass, and discredit. The campaign of petty harassment had a chilling effect on the community. The neighbors who had privately thanked me for speaking up now averted their eyes when I walked by. They were scared. They saw what was happening to me, and they didn't want to be next. They had mortgages to pay, families to raise. They couldn't afford a constant barrage of fines or the stress of being on Carol's bad side. I didn't blame them, but it was a lonely feeling. I was fighting for them, but I was fighting alone. My only real ally in this was Dave, an old friend who lived 2 streets over. Dave had been on the HOA board years ago, back when it was a reasonable organization, and he'd served as treasurer. He knew the bylaws inside and out, at least the ones that weren't invented on the spot by Carol. I went over to his house one evening, the collection of violation notices in my hand. He poured us both a coffee and listened patiently as I laid out the whole story. "She's trying to bury you, John," he said, shaking his head as he looked at the fines. "This is classic Carol. She can't win a logical argument, so she changes the rules and attacks the person. The problem is, she holds all the cards. The bylaws give the president a lot of discretionary power, and she's exploiting every loophole. What about the other board members?" I asked. "Are they all just going to let her run the association into the ground?" "They're terrified of her," Dave said grimly. "2 of them are new to the neighborhood, they don't know any better. The other 2, well, they just don't have the spine to stand up to her. It's easier to rubber stamp her decisions than to face her wrath." He leaned forward, his expression serious. "But this $80,000 roof, that's different. That's not just petty tyranny. That's grand larceny. People are scared, but they're also angry. They just don't know what to do." The breaking point for me came a week later, and it wasn't another fine. It was seeing Mrs. Gable, the elderly widow who lived at the end of my street, crying as she checked her mail. I walked over and asked if she was all right. She was holding her own special assessment notice, her hands trembling. "I don't have this kind of money, John," she whispered, her voice choked with tears. "My husband's pension is all I have. After the property taxes and the insurance, there's not much left. $1,000, it might as well be $1 million." Seeing her distress, her genuine fear, solidified my resolve. This wasn't about me anymore. It wasn't about my pride or the ridiculous fines for my garden hose. It was about protecting people like Mrs. Gable from a predator who was using her position of power to enrich herself and intimidate her neighbors. Carol had made this personal. Now, so had I. I told Mrs. Gable not to worry, that I was looking into it, and that she shouldn't pay a dime until we got some real answers. I wasn't sure how I was going to fix it, but I knew I had to try. The fines continued to escalate. By the end of the month, I had accumulated over $500 in penalties for a string of increasingly absurd infractions. The final straw was a certified letter informing me that if the fines and the special assessment were not paid in full within 30 days, the HOA would be placing a lien on my property. A lien? That was a serious legal threat, one that could cloud the title to my home and make it impossible to sell or refinance. Carol was no longer just being a nuisance, she was threatening my single largest financial asset. My home. That was the moment I knew I couldn't fight this alone anymore. This was no longer a neighborhood squabble. It was a legal battle. I went through the phone book and found a lawyer, a man named Arthur Jennings, who specialized in real estate law and, specifically, HOA disputes. His website was filled with testimonials from homeowners who had been in situations just like mine. I made an appointment for the following afternoon. Arthur was a calm, methodical man in his late 50s with a neat grey beard and a reassuring demeanor. I laid out the whole story on his polished mahogany desk: Carol's rise to power, the petty fines, the public meeting, the suspicious $80,000 assessment, and the final threat of a lien. I handed him the stack of violation notices and the assessment letter. He read through them carefully, his expression unreadable. "Well, Mr. Miller," he said after a long silence, leaning back in his chair. "You've certainly found yourself in a classic petty tyrant situation. It's textbook. An insecure person gains a small amount of power and then wields it like a sledgehammer." He steepled his fingers. "The bad news is that HOAs often have broad powers granted to them by the covenants and state law. Fighting them can be an uphill battle. The lien is a real threat. They can, and will, foreclose on your home for unpaid dues and fines if you're not careful." A cold dread washed over me. "So what's the good news?" I asked. "The good news," Arthur said with a slight smile, "is that they are not above the law. Their power is not absolute. They are required to act in good faith, to exercise fiduciary duty, and to maintain transparency. And that $80,000 roof smells to high heaven. It's your leverage. It's the key to this whole thing." He leaned forward again. "The fines are a distraction. They're designed to harass you and drain your resources. The real fight is the special assessment. If you can prove fraud or gross negligence there, her entire house of cards comes tumbling down. But she won't give me the documents, I said, frustrated. I asked for the invoices at the meeting, and she shut me down. She can't legally deny you, Arthur explained. As a homeowner, you have a right to inspect the association's financial records. We will draft a formal, legally binding request for records. We'll ask for all board meeting minutes related to the roof repair, all bids received from contractors, the final contract that was signed, and every single invoice and proof of payment related to the project. We'll send it via certified mail. If she ignores or refuses this, she will be in direct violation of state law, and we can take her to court to compel her to produce the documents. A surge of hope, the first I'd felt in weeks, coursed through me. I finally had a plan. A strategy. I wasn't just a lone homeowner flailing against a corrupt system anymore. I had the law on my side. So we send the letter, I said. And then what? And then, Arthur said, his eyes glinting, you use your professional expertise. Once we get those documents, you are going to take them apart, piece by piece. You're the contractor. You'll spot the irregularities long before I will. We need to find the smoking gun. We need irrefutable proof that this was not a legitimate business transaction. He handed me a retainer agreement. It won't be cheap, John. But from what you've told me, the alternative is much more expensive. I signed the papers without hesitation. It was the best money I'd ever spent. The formal request for records, drafted on Arthur's imposing legal letterhead, was sent the next day. A week later, a thick manila envelope arrived from the HOA's law firm. It wasn't the documents I had requested. It was a letter from Carol's lawyer, a classic piece of legal stonewalling. It stated that my request was overly broad and burdensome, and that providing such detailed records would compromise the proprietary negotiating strategies of the association. It was nonsense, of course, a transparent attempt to hide the truth. But they did include one document, a single, heavily redacted invoice from a company called Titan Roofing and Construction. The total at the bottom was a neat, round $80,000. Most of the line items were blacked out, citing contractor confidentiality. This is a joke, I said to Arthur over the phone. This tells me nothing. On the contrary, Arthur replied calmly. It tells us everything. It tells us they're hiding something, and they're hiding it badly. They've made a critical mistake. They gave us the name of the contractor, Titan Roofing and Construction. The name didn't ring a bell, which was strange. I had been in the business in this area for 4 decades. I knew every major player, every reputable roofer, every fly-by-night operation. I had never heard of them. I started my investigation the old-fashioned way. I checked the state's business registry. Titan Roofing and Construction was a registered LLC. It was a new company, formed only 6 months prior. The registered agent and principal was a name I didn't recognize. The address listed was just a post office box in a neighboring town. This was getting stranger by the minute. I decided to do some real-world digging. I drove by the clubhouse and took a closer look at the new roof. The work itself was adequate. Not great, but not terrible. It was a standard architectural shingle, competently installed. It was a $12,000 job, top to bottom. There was no universe in which this roof cost $80,000. As I was leaving, I noticed something I hadn't seen before. Tucked away behind some bushes near the service entrance was a discarded bundle of shingle wrappers. I pulled one out. It had the brand name and the color code. It also had a lot number and, more importantly, the name of the supplier, ABC Building Supply, the biggest contractor supplier in the county. This was the break I needed. I had done millions of dollars of business with ABC over the years. I still had a house account there, even though I was retired. The next morning, I drove over to their lumberyard. The manager, a guy named Frank, had been working the counter since he was a teenager. He greeted me with a warm handshake. "John! Good to see you. Don't tell me you're coming out of retirement. The young guys can't keep up with you, or not a chance, Frank," I laughed. "My back is officially retired, even if my brain isn't." I'm actually here on a little fact-finding mission. I need a favor. I explained the situation with my HOA and the mysterious Titan Roofing. I gave him the shingle brand and lot number from the wrapper. I'm just trying to figure out who bought the materials for this job. I know you can't give me their pricing, but could you just tell me if a company called Titan Roofing has an account here and if they purchased this specific material recently? Frank nodded, his expression turning serious. An HOA charging 80 grand for a simple re-roof? That's highway robbery. Let me see what I can find. He disappeared into his office. He was gone for about 15 minutes. When he came back, he was holding a single sheet of paper and had a strange look on his face. "This is weird, John," he said, lowering his voice. "Titan Roofing and Construction doesn't have an account with us. They've never bought a thing here, what?" I was stunned. "But the shingles came from here." "The wrappers are in the bushes, I know," Frank said, pointing to the paper. I ran the lot number. The materials for that clubhouse job were purchased about 2 months ago. But they were purchased by a different company. A small outfit called Sal's Roofing. The owner is a guy named Sal DeLuca. Does that name mean anything to you? Sal DeLuca. The name hit me like a ton of bricks. Of course I knew Sal. He was a good man, an old-school roofer who ran a small, honest, 2-man operation. I had subcontracted work to him a dozen times over the years. He was reliable, did quality work, and his prices were always fair. He was the last person I'd expect to be involved in a fraudulent scheme. There had to be more to the story. "Frank, you're a lifesaver," I said, shaking his hand. "Can I keep this?" He hesitated for a second, then nodded and slid the paper across the counter. It was a copy of the materials invoice. The buyer was Sal's Roofing. The total cost for all materials, shingles, underlayment, nails, flashing, was just under $4,000. I left the supply yard with my head spinning. So, Sal DeLuca did the work, but the HOA paid a ghost company called Titan Roofing. And they paid them $80,000. The pieces were starting to come together, and the picture they were forming was ugly. I drove straight from the supply yard to the address I had for Sal's business, a small house with a detached garage in a working-class neighborhood. I found Sal in his driveway, loading tools into his truck. He looked up when I pulled in, and a broad smile crossed his face. "John, what are you doing in this part of town? Don't tell me you're looking for work." We shook hands, and I got right to the point. I told him about my HOA, about Carol, and about the $80,000 invoice from Titan Roofing. As I spoke, the smile faded from Sal's face. He looked uncomfortable, then angry. "I knew it," he muttered, kicking the tire of his truck. I knew there was something shady about that job. He invited me inside, and his wife brought us coffee. He told me the whole story. He was approached about 2 months ago by a man who introduced himself as a project manager for the Oak Creek Meadows HOA. The man's name was Martin. Martin told Sal he had a simple clubhouse re-roof job and asked for a bid. Sal looked at the job and submitted a written bid for $12,000, which was a fair price for the labor and materials. Martin told me my price was good, Sal explained, but there was a catch. He said the HOA had a special arrangement with a primary contractor called Titan Roofing. He told me that for billing purposes, I would have to run my invoice through them. He said Titan would pay me my $12,000, and then they would bill the HOA. It sounded a little weird, but I figured it was just some corporate bureaucracy. So I did the job, submitted my invoice to Titan, and they paid me my $12,000, no questions asked. I never even met anyone from Titan. I just dealt with this Martin guy. "This Martin?" I asked, my heart starting to pound. "What was his last name?" Sal shrugged. "I don't know if he ever told me." "Let me check the paperwork." He went to a filing cabinet in the corner and pulled out a folder. He leafed through a few pages. Here it is. The contract I signed. It was with Titan, but the signature for them is to Martin Gable, project manager Martin Gable. The name was vaguely familiar. Then it clicked. I remembered reading Carol's Christmas newsletter from 2 years ago, the one where she introduced herself to the community after being elected president. She had mentioned her family, her children, and her beloved brother-in-law who had just moved to the area. Her brother-in-law's name was Martin. Martin Gable. This was it. This was the smoking gun. Carol hadn't just inflated a bill. She had invented a company, or used her brother-in-law's shell company, to funnel $80,000 of the HOA's money into her own family's pockets. She paid Sal his $12,000 and her brother-in-law kept the other $68,000 for his project management services. It was blatant, criminal fraud. I asked Sal if he would be willing to give me a copy of his contract with Titan and a copy of his invoice to them. He was hesitant at first, worried about getting dragged into a legal mess. Sal, I said, looking him in the eye. They used you. They used your good name and your honest work as a cover for their crime. They are trying to force me and my neighbors, including a sweet old widow on a fixed income, to pay for their theft. I'm not going to let that happen. But I need your help. He thought about it for a long minute, then nodded. You're right, John. It's not right. He went to his copy machine and made copies of everything, his original bid, the contract signed by Martin Gable, and his final invoice for $12,000. He even signed an affidavit I wrote out by hand, attesting that $12,000 was the total and complete cost of the work he performed. I now had an irrefutable paper trail that exposed the entire scheme. Armed with this bombshell, my strategy shifted completely. I was no longer on the defensive, trying to protect myself from fines and liens. I was on the offense. I had the evidence to not only stop the special assessment but to bring Carol's entire corrupt regime crashing down. I immediately called my lawyer, Arthur. I told him everything I had found. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. John, he finally said, his voice filled with a new level of respect. You've done it. This is better than a smoking gun. This is a signed confession. We have them, dead to rights. We spent the next week preparing our attack. Arthur advised against going to the board directly. They'll just circle the wagons and try to destroy the evidence, he warned. We need to present this in a forum where they can't control the narrative. The perfect opportunity was coming up, the HOA's annual meeting. It was mandated by the bylaws, it was open to all homeowners, and it was the one meeting a year where a large turnout was guaranteed because it was when the next year's budget was approved. My friend Dave helped me rally the troops. We went door to door, not with accusations, but with a simple, urgent plea. The annual meeting is next Tuesday, we told our neighbors. The board is voting on a new budget that includes the $80,000 roof assessment. It is critical that you be there. We have some important information to share that affects every single homeowner. We didn't reveal our hand. We just built the anticipation. By the time the night of the meeting arrived, the clubhouse was overflowing. People were standing along the walls and spilling out into the hallway. It was the largest crowd anyone had ever seen at an HOA meeting. Carol and her board were at the front table, looking slightly unnerved by the massive turnout. But she quickly regained her composure, plastering on her familiar, smug smile. She clearly thought this was just a larger version of the last meeting, a bunch of residents she could easily intimidate and dismiss. She ran through the agenda, her voice tight with authority. When she got to the budget presentation, she proudly announced the $80,000 expenditure as a completed project and a major accomplishment. Then came the open forum for homeowner questions. A few people asked nervous questions about the rising monthly dues. Carol answered them with her usual condescending non-answers. Then, I stood up. A hush fell over the room. All eyes were on me. Carol's smile vanished, replaced by a look of pure venom. Mr. Miller, she said, her voice dripping with ice. You are permitted one question. Make it brief, thank you, Madam President, I said, my voice calm and steady, amplified by the perfect silence in the room. I don't have a question. I have a presentation. Before she could object, I walked to the front of the room and stood beside the podium. I had brought a projector and a laptop. Dave helped me set it up. On the screen, I projected the first image, a high-quality copy of the redacted, $80,000 invoice from Titan Roofing that the HOA had provided. This, I began, is the invoice the board has presented to justify the special assessment. It is for $80,000, from a company called Titan Roofing and Construction. I let the image sink in for a moment. Then I clicked to the next slide. It was a copy of Sal DeLuca's original, signed bid. And this, I said, my voice rising slightly, is the actual bid for the job, from the real contractor who did the work, Sal's Roofing. As you can see, the total price was $12,000. A collective gasp swept through the room. People were leaning forward in their seats, their faces a mixture of shock and dawning comprehension. Carol was on her feet, her face as white as a sheet. "This is out of order. This is unapproved material. Turn that off," she shrieked. But no one was listening to her. They were captivated by the screen. I clicked to the next slide. It was the contract between Sal's Roofing and Titan, signed by Martin Gable. The board told our contractor, Sal DeLuca, that he had to bill through this other company, Titan Roofing. A company, by the way, that was formed just 6 months ago. And the man who signed this contract as the project manager for Titan was a man named Martin Gable. I paused, letting the name hang in the air. Then I turned and looked directly at Carol. "Isn't that the name of your brother-in-law, Carol?" The room erupted. It was pandemonium. People were shouting, pointing, demanding answers. Carol stood there, speechless, her mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. Her board members looked horrified, shrinking down in their seats as if they could disappear into the floor. They clearly had no idea about the depth of her deception. They were just her pawns. Over the din, I raised my voice for the final blow. "So, to be clear," I yelled, "a $12,000 job was billed to us for $80,000. The $68,000 difference was funneled through a shell company run by the president's brother-in-law. This isn't mismanagement. This is theft. This is embezzlement of our association's funds." Just as Carol seemed to find her voice, ready to unleash a torrent of denials and threats, a calm, authoritative figure stood up from the back of the room. It was my lawyer, Arthur Jennings. He had been sitting quietly in the back the whole time. "My name is Arthur Jennings," he announced, his voice cutting through the noise. "I am legal counsel for Mr. Miller. I would advise the members of the board to remain silent. We have already compiled this evidence, including a signed affidavit from the contractor who performed the work, and have submitted it to the district attorney's office. An official criminal investigation is already underway." That was the final nail in the coffin. The mention of the district attorney sent a wave of panic through the board members. Carol looked like she had been physically struck. Her face crumpled, and with a strangled cry, she turned and fled the room, pushing her way through the stunned crowd. The meeting completely fell apart. Her reign was over. In the space of 10 minutes, under the bright, unforgiving light of a projector, her little empire of lies and intimidation had been utterly demolished. The fallout was swift and spectacular. The very next day, 2 detectives from the county's white-collar crime unit showed up at Carol's house with a search warrant. They seized her computers, her financial records, and every document related to the HOA. The other board members, terrified of being charged as accessories, resigned en masse and gave full, detailed statements to the police, all of them claiming they had been duped by Carol and had no knowledge of the scheme. Within a week, both Carol and her brother-in-law, Martin, were arrested and charged with multiple felonies, including embezzlement, wire fraud, and conspiracy. The story hit the local news, and our quiet little subdivision was suddenly the talk of the town. The headlines were brutal: HOA president accused of embezzling funds in roofing scam, retired contractor uncovers corruption in quiet suburb. I tried to stay out of the spotlight, but my phone rang off the hook with reporters and even producers from national talk shows. I politely declined all of them. I hadn't done this for fame. I had done it because it was the right thing to do. With the old board gone, an emergency meeting was called to elect an interim board to manage the association's affairs until a proper election could be held. I was nominated for president, but I immediately turned it down. I had no desire to be the new Carol. My friend Dave, however, with his past experience as treasurer, was the perfect choice to lead the cleanup. He was elected interim president by a unanimous vote. His first act was to formally cancel the special assessment and issue a notice that all fines levied by Carol in the past 6 months were null and void. A cheer went up in the clubhouse that night that I'm sure they heard in the next town over. The legal process ground on for the better part of a year. Carol's lawyers tried every trick in the book, but the evidence was simply overwhelming. The paper trail I had uncovered, combined with the testimony of Sal DeLuca and the forensic accountants from the DA's office, painted a clear and damning picture of her guilt. The trial was short. The jury deliberated for less than 2 hours before returning a guilty verdict on all counts. The judge was not lenient. In his sentencing, he spoke of the profound betrayal of trust, how Carol had preyed upon her own neighbors for personal gain. She was sentenced to 2 to 5 years in state prison and ordered to pay full restitution of the $68,000 she had stolen. Her brother-in-law received a similar sentence. Justice had been served, not just for me, but for Mrs. Gable and everyone else in Oak Creek Meadows. In the aftermath, our community began to heal. Under Dave's leadership, the HOA was completely reformed. We hired an independent accounting firm to audit the books, and we rewrote the bylaws to ensure complete transparency and accountability. Decisions were no longer made by a single person behind closed doors. Everything was open, everything was discussed, and everything was voted on. The monthly dues were rolled back to a reasonable level, just enough to cover the actual costs of maintaining our shared spaces. The monstrous sign Carol had built was torn down and replaced with a simple, elegant wooden one that we all built together one Saturday. The neighborhood started to feel like a neighborhood again. About 2 years after the trial, I was at the local grocery store, picking up some things for dinner. As I came around the corner of an aisle, I almost bumped into a woman who was staring intently at a can of soup. She looked tired and worn, much older than I remembered. It took me a second to realize it was Carol. She had been released from prison early for good behavior. She saw me at the same moment, and her eyes widened in a flash of fear, then shame. She looked down at the floor, clutching her shopping basket like a shield. I didn't feel anger or triumph. I just felt a strange, detached sense of pity. Her quest for power and control had cost her everything, her home, her freedom, her reputation. She had become a ghost in the town she once ruled. I simply nodded at her, a small, quiet acknowledgement, and continued on with my shopping. We didn't exchange a word. There was nothing left to say. Looking back on it all now, the whole bizarre episode feels like a strange dream. It taught me a valuable lesson, though. It taught me that tyranny doesn't always arrive with tanks and soldiers. Sometimes, it shows up in a sensible sedan, gets elected president of the HOA, and starts telling you how to coil your garden hose. It thrives in apathy and grows in the soil of good people who are too busy or too intimidated to speak up. But it also taught me that one person, armed with the truth and a little bit of righteous indignation, can make a difference. Bullies, no matter how powerful they seem, are often just a house of cards waiting for a steady hand to push them over. My life has returned to the quiet peace I always wanted. My workshop is my sanctuary again, filled with the smell of sawdust and the promise of new projects. The other day, I was out on my front porch, putting a fresh coat of sealant on a new birdhouse I'd built. Mrs. Gable walked by on her afternoon stroll. She smiled and waved. "That's a beautiful birdhouse, John," she said. "The birds are lucky to have you looking out for them," I smiled back. "We all have to look out for each other," I said. And in that simple exchange, in the quiet, peaceful hum of our restored community, I knew that we finally were. I was back to being just John, the retired contractor, a neighbor among neighbors. And I wouldn't have it any other way.